it's raining, and the light is always kind of weird this time of day, especially when it's raining. But my dad used to love to just sit on the porch in the rocking chair and watch it rain. And a horror movie, I'm talking about horror movies, but a horror movie I saw with my dad. It's called The Mansions of Madness, which is, it came out in 1974. I must have seen it 10 years later, or 15 years later, I don't even know. I saw a lot of movies that I was way too young to see, and I appreciate my mom and dad for doing that. Most of the movies were, things like Amadeus, and the Coen Brothers movies, stuff like that. And, just my personal view is, it's totally okay. It shaped me as a kid. I watched Twin Peaks all the time with my dad. That's kind of a horror show, a little bit. But yeah, I mean, the Mansion of Madness, definitely not one for kids, but I did see that when I was a kid with my family, which is weird looking back at it for sure. But I do appreciate that for sure. I mean, I'm a huge horror fan now, and I could trace it back to stuff like that. But the Mansion of Madness, I think that fits the category of my idiosyncratic top 10 horror. Because I've never seen it on any other list that I know of. It's obscure, but I don't know if it's the kind of... It may qualify as this, I don't know. But I don't know if it's the kind of obscure that you would name drop it just to sound cool, I don't know. I think it's very cool, I think it's an awesome movie, but that's definitely not my motivation behind it. It's just I saw it when I was a kid, and it was very inspirational to me. It's definitely not ironically bad. It's a wacky movie. It's very 70s, but it's a wacky movie. But it's not ironically bad at all, I wouldn't say. So it fits my criteria, for my self-imposed criteria for this idiosyncratic top 10. But it's based on the system of Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's a classic dynamic for a horror movie. There are a lot of adaptations of that particular story. Stonehurst Asylum, I think, is the most recent one. But this sort of dynamic shows up in a lot of other horror movies, for sure. I just watched one just a few minutes ago called Eli, and I watched it just with zero expectations whatsoever, and it kind of had that dynamic too. So the dynamic is you go into a hospital, or you go into an insane asylum, or not as the asylum, you're not going as a patient, you're just touring the asylum, or you're an employee of the asylum or something like that. And it turns out you get the suspicion that the people running the asylum are just as crazy as the crazy people, or there's something sinister really going on. The one I just watched, Eli, it had that with a kid who had an immune disease, so it ramped up the vulnerability issue, for sure. Very, very, very vulnerable kid, but it also had ghosts, and it seemed like, are the doctors really out to get him? Is he just going crazy? They say it's the drugs making him hallucinate. Is that the situation? But movies like that, they're just... The twist is usually, the key thing with those movies. And, if you know any of the Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether movies, or if you know cliches about lunatics in asylums, you can see it coming, spoiler alert, but it's one of those twists that, you can see it coming, but it's still super fun. But it ramps up the craziness. It flips the schema. This is an effect of the movie, or a structural concept of the movie that's a bit different than the other two that I was talking about, where, especially like a Thrasher movie or a Lost in the Woods type of movie, they ramp up the threat to the vulnerable characters pretty significantly, pretty steadily throughout the movie. And the dynamic is usually, visceral imagery, just intense visceral imagery of violence, matched with a relatively low connection with the character, except for maybe the final girl or a small handful of characters you'll feel some sort of connection to. But that's to create the effect of fear, certainly. It's created the effect of, visceral stimulation through empathetic experience of violence and that sort of thing. And the schema comes into effect. I haven't talked much about that. Horror movies are so pure because they rely really just heavily on the first two levels, the pure visceral stimulation and the paradox of switching, of elimination of the facade, of the dynamic shift from subtext to text, where the facade gets stripped away and somebody becomes more animalistic. That's your basic core of any horror movie, really. But, and the schema is in effect. The schema is just the organizational principle valid really only intrinsically within the story form itself, so, and as a horror movie, that's there as part of the horror movie. And final girl movies, like You're Next I mentioned before, it definitely flips the schema in the expectations of movies like that. Bound to Vengeance, I almost forgot the name of that movie again, but Bound to Vengeance flips it right from the beginning, because it starts in a spot that's totally unexpected, and develops in a very different way than expected. But the twist tends to be massive schema shifting, where you think you're watching one movie and it ends up you're watching a different movie. And Eli definitely does that. Very different genre, no spoilers, but a very different genre it turns into. But Mansion of Madness, the schema shifting happens when you sort of slowly suspect, and lots of movies like this, but you sort of slowly suspect, something's up with the doctors, maybe they're doing something nefarious to the patients. There's something more subtly sinister. And then there tends to be a very sudden shift. The Thrasher movies will ramp up, more and more kills, getting closer and closer to the final girl, and then the final part would be the chase of the final girl. But this type of movie, it tends to be, a pretty dramatic pivot towards the 2/3 mark of the movie, roughly. And then the whole last part of the movie, the situation is just radically different. But Mansion of Madness just does that, really beautifully. But the thing that stood out, I was a kid when I watched it, so one of the movie images I'll never forget. The spoiler alert, obviously the lunatics take over the asylum, and there's this one scene where this nude woman is riding a horse. I was a kid when I saw this, and I'll never ever forget this image. But they were forcing this nude woman to ride a horse. And I remembered it as a maze. I guess it wasn't really a maze, but I just remember that a hedgerow maze. They were forcing this woman to ride a horse through a hedgerow maze. And that's the thing about horror movies is, a lot of times you don't even remember the characters all that much. The final girls being the exceptions, and other types of characters here and there being the exceptions, but it's not like Mansion of Madness. Mansion of Madness. I couldn't name the characters. Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether are referenced. I remember that really vividly. It's such a weird, out of place pun, but very frequently it's just really intense imagery that tends to stand out. A really gory kill, for example, or just something just really surreal and just complicatedly visceral sort of imagery. And, Mansion Madness has lots of that. I mean, it's a beautifully shot movie. It's just, I'm not a film expert, I'm just looking at the storyline. But storyline-wise, it's intensely viscerally impactful in that the pivot is just really well done. It's just, all of a sudden, you have this slow growing suspicion that something is not right, and then pivot, everyone is crazy, and everyone just acts violently and starts attacking the main characters. And you have just really, really shocking images, but for whatever reason I was a kid when I saw it, so I can imagine the reason, but for whatever reason, that image of the woman on the horse, is just, if I think about just striking, unforgettable images, that's certainly one from my childhood that I'll never forget. But anyway, check it out. It's definitely very 70s, but definitely a great movie that I just never ever see on anybody's list. What will I choose for my fourth pick? Who knows? I don't know. We'll see. See you in the next episode.